The air is thick, a soupy cocktail of jungle humidity, damp earth, and the metallic stench of old blood. Smoke stings the eyes. In the flickering lamplight of a cave carved from Okinawan mud, shadows dance across the faces of the wounded. A low, constant drone vibrates through the rock. American B-29s, a perpetual reminder of a world closing in. For the nurses of the Imperial Japanese Army, this was reality. War paints the world in simple colors, good and evil, us and them. The enemy was a caricature, a brutish American devil. To be captured was a fate worse than death, the ultimate dishonor, a stain on one's family, a betrayal of the emperor. This creed was drilled into every soldier, every citizen. It was the lens through which they saw their world. But what happens when the devil you were taught to fear shows you a kindness you were denied by your own people? This is the story of the Japanese women who fell into enemy hands and discovered a shocking, paradoxical truth. Subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from as we explore this forgotten chapter of the war. To understand their shock, you must first understand the world they left behind. A nurse, we will call her Fumiko Tanaka, lived in a state of slow-motion collapse. Her duty was sacred, but her tools were primitive. Bandages were washed in brackish water and reused until they disintegrated. Anesthesia was a distant memory. The only painkiller was a stern command to endure it for the emperor. And then there was the hunger, a gnawing, ever-present emptiness. A single gritty rice ball per day was a luxury. The women, like the soldiers they tended, were skeletal. Diaries discovered years later speak of a profound weakness, a world that had shrunk to the singular, desperate desire for one more mouthful of food. This physical hardship was secondary to the psychological cruelty. The doctrine of Gyokusai, or shattering the jewel, demanded death before surrender. It was not a suggestion. It was an order. Wounded soldiers, men Fumiko and her colleagues tried to save, were sometimes given a grenade and told to perform a final, honorable service. Discipline was absolute. A moment of hesitation could earn a nurse a sharp slap across the face from an officer. A public humiliation. Compassion was a liability. Survival was secondary to sacrifice. This was the honor they knew. This was the system they were prepared to die for. Then the end came, not as a noble sacrifice, but in a storm of fire and steel. The American assault was overwhelming. The roar of Sherman tank engines, the percussive thump of heavy machine guns, the terrifying shriek of incoming artillery. It was the sound of their world being torn apart. Fumiko huddled in the back of the cave with a handful of other survivors. The last grenade lay unused. She waited for the inevitable. She had seen the propaganda posters, the leering American soldiers with horns and claws. She had heard the stories of torture. Death was preferable. Death was escape. A silhouette appeared in the cave mouth, blocking the light. A voice shouted in a rough, foreign tongue. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on her face. This was it, the moment of dishonor. Her body tensed, preparing for the blow that would end her life. But the blow never came. Instead, a hand reached out, not to strike, but to help her to her feet. Another soldier offered a canteen. The water was clean, cool. It was the first clean water she had tasted in months. This mercy was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been taught, that it could only be a trick, a prelude to some more sophisticated, unimaginable cruelty. The journey to the prisoner of war camp was a silent one, a blur of truck beds and the indifferent faces of young American guards. Each mile was a step deeper into dishonor. But the destination was not the death pit Fumiko had been promised. It was something far more confusing. It was organized. The first thing she noticed was the smell, not the familiar stench of rot and disease, but the sharp, clean scent of carbolic soap and antiseptic. She and the other women were processed with a strange, impersonal efficiency. Their hair was dusted with delousing powder. Their wounds, which had festered for weeks, were cleaned and dressed with fresh gauze by American medics. They were given rough-spun but clean clothing. And then came the first meal. It was not a gritty ball of rice. It was a metal tray holding a scoop of beef stew, a thick slice of white bread, and a canned peach half swimming in syrup. The flavor was alien. The substance was a miracle. It was more food than she had eaten in a week. She watched the other women, their eyes wide, eating slowly, as if afraid the vision would vanish. According to a United States Provost Marshal General's report, Japanese prisoners were to receive the same daily rations as American soldiers. This policy, a bureaucratic footnote in the logistics of war, was psychologically shattering. For women systematically starved by their own army, an army that prioritized ammunition over food, this abundance was not just humane, it was an indictment. The small details chipped away at a lifetime of indoctrination. One afternoon, a guard handed her a small brown bar wrapped in paper, a Hershey's D ration. It was dense and slightly bitter, designed for survival, not pleasure. But to her, it was the richest, most decadent thing she had ever tasted. The United States produced over 3 billion such bars during the war. An industrial might so vast, it could afford to give away chocolate in the middle of a battlefield. Another nurse, in a post-war testimony, recalled her first encounter with peanut butter. A guard, seeing her hunger, offered her a cracker smeared with the thick brown paste. The sticky, salty, sweet taste was so bizarre, so utterly foreign, it made her weep. It was not the taste of home, it was the taste of a world where people were not constantly starving. If this story surprises you, if you are beginning to see the war from a different angle, subscribe to our channel. Let us know you are here. The cultural assault was relentless. From a distant tent, she could hear the alien sounds of jazz music drifting from a radio. She saw guards in their off hours tossing a baseball back and forth, a display of casual, pointless leisure she could not comprehend. One sweltering day, a truck delivered crates of sweating, dark brown glass bottles. Coca-Cola. A guard handed one to her. The cold, fizzy shock on her tongue was a revelation. A sweet, joyful, utterly unnecessary luxury. How could the horned devil from the propaganda posters create something like this? This kindness was its own form of psychological torture. It created a paradox that tore at the very core of her identity. The divine nation she served had treated her as disposable, starving her and driving her toward a meaningless death. The demonic enemy she was sworn to fight was feeding her, clothing her, and treating her with a basic dignity she had forgotten existed. The betrayal she felt was not from her capture, it was from her own commanders. Where was the honor in a system that let its own people rot while the enemy provided medicine? Where was the glory in starving for an emperor while your captors gave you 3 meals a day? One woman later wrote in a secret diary, "I am a prisoner. This is the greatest shame. But today, an American doctor spent an hour changing the dressing on my leg. My own captain would have told me to amputate it with a rusty saw. Who is the real devil?" The barbed wire fence was real. The armed guards in the towers were real. She was a captive. Yet, inside this prison, she experienced a strange and terrifying freedom. Freedom from the gnawing hunger. Freedom from the casual cruelty of her officers. Freedom from the relentless pressure to die. Her captivity was becoming more dignified than the freedom she had known. The Americans began a new kind of war, a war for their minds. It was not fought with bullets, but with facts. One evening, the women were led to a large tent where a projector flickered to life. They were shown films, not Hollywood fantasies of dancing and romance. These were newsreels, captured by combat cameramen, grainy, shaking images of Nanking, of Manila, of the Bataan Death March. They saw Japanese soldiers, men who looked like their brothers and fathers, committing atrocities they could not have imagined. The propaganda posters had lied about the enemy. Had they also lied about the righteousness of their own cause? The next assault came in the form of a lecture. A Japanese-American Nisei officer stood before them, his voice calm and steady. He did not speak of morality, he spoke of mathematics. He posted charts showing industrial production. Japan had built 400 heavy bombers during the entire war. America, he explained, was building that many in a single week. For every 1 rifle their factories produced, American factories produced 100. The numbers were cold, emotionless, and absolute. They revealed a truth more devastating than any battlefield loss. Their struggle was not just difficult, it was impossible. Their sacrifice was not for victory, it was for nothing. This onslaught of truth shattered the last pillars of their world. The indoctrination, so carefully constructed over a lifetime, crumbled in a matter of days. For some, the kindness had been confusing. The facts were unbearable. The shame of capture was now compounded by the shame of their nation's actions and the futility of their own suffering. The psychological breaking point had arrived. Despair spread through the barracks like a disease. Some women fell into a silent depression, refusing to eat the food that had once seemed like a miracle. For them, every meal was now a reminder of their nation's failure. A few sought the only escape their training had ever offered. In the quiet of the night, they tried to take their own lives, using scraps of metal or cloth, clinging to the last tenet of their broken code. They were always found. The American medics who saved them were gentle, but their actions felt like another violation, denying them even an honorable death. Fumiko watched this collapse. She saw the vacant eyes of women who had once been so proud. She felt the same pull of the abyss, the urge to simply cease to exist, to erase the shame. She thought of the hunger in the caves, the casual cruelty of her own officers, the grenades she never used. Then she looked at the clean bandage on another woman's arm, a dressing changed daily by a quiet American corpsman. She felt the substance of the food in her belly, a simple biological reality that defied ideology. Honor demanded she die, her own body demanded she live. A new, terrifying thought began to form in her mind. Perhaps true honor was not in dying for a lie. Perhaps it was in surviving to face the truth. To endure was its own form of resistance. To choose life, even a life of shame, was to reject the entire system that had sent her to her death. It was a quiet, internal rebellion, but it was the most profound decision she had ever made. The routine of the camp became their new reality. The shock subsided into a numb acceptance. They were prisoners. They would survive. But what were they surviving for? The question hung in the humid air, unanswered. Then one afternoon the routine was broken. A new energy filled the camp. The guards gathered in small, excited groups around the radios. The broadcasts were no longer jazz music, but the urgent, staccato voice of news anchors. A rumor spread through the wire fence, a word whispered in a language they barely understood, Hiroshima, then another word, Nagasaki. An announcement was made. All prisoners were to assemble in the main yard. An officer stood on a wooden crate, a portable radio with a large speaker beside him. He turned a dial. A storm of static filled the air, then a voice. It was a high-pitched, formal voice, speaking a form of Japanese so courtly it was almost a foreign language. But they all recognized it. Every man, woman, and child in Japan knew that voice, though none had ever heard it before. It was the voice of the emperor, the voice of a god. And that god was speaking of surrender. The war was over. For the women in the prison camp there was no relief, only a silent, soul-crushing dread. Their world had not just been defeated, it had ceased to exist. The silence that followed the emperor's broadcast was heavier than any bomb. The war was over. For the women in the prison camp, this was not a moment of liberation. It was a verdict. They were to be sent home, back to a nation that viewed prisoners not as survivors, but as ghosts who lacked the courage to die. The journey back was a reversal of their capture, the same ships, the same impersonal efficiency. But now, the silence was their own. They were no longer prisoners of the Americans. They were prisoners of their own story, a story they could never tell. They arrived not to a land of gods and glory, but to a nation of ashes. Cities flattened, a people starving. The order and relative abundance of the American camp was a memory now, a surreal dream. The reality of post-war Japan was far harsher than their captivity. Here, the hunger was real again. The despair was everywhere. In the ruins, they saw the undeniable truth of the production charts the Americans had shown them. Their sacrifice had been for nothing. Their families greeted them not with joyous tears, but with a quiet, unbearable shame. To have a daughter return from an enemy camp was a stain. They were living proof of failure. They were expected to disappear, to melt back into society, and never speak of what had happened. They traded one cage for another. The barbed wire was gone, but the walls of shame were invisible and just as strong. Fumiko and the others learned to live as ghosts in their own lives. They married, had children, and grew old, carrying their secret in silence. The physical scars of the war faded, but the psychological wounds, the ones inflicted by kindness, festered for a lifetime. This was their final, paradoxical truth. The greatest shock of the war was not the B-29 bombers. It was not the defeat. It was not the atomic bomb. The greatest shock was a clean bandage, a bar of chocolate, a cup of Coca-Cola. It was the simple, undeniable, dishonorable kindness of the enemy. They had been prepared to die at the hands of a devil. They were completely unprepared to be saved by a human being. Their own culture had demanded their death as the highest honor. Their enemy had insisted on their life, and in doing so, had handed them a lifetime of shame. Their survival was their ultimate dishonor. And it was also their most profound, silent, and enduring act of rebellion. If this story has changed the way you see the world, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories. What part of their experience shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below.